Wow.
Should we start recordings?
Not yet. I don't. Yeah, now I will start it. مرحبا جميعا. نحن فقط.
Hello everyone. We are waiting a minute before we let everyone in. I am letting participants in. Is there anybody, Areli? Is there anybody still waiting in the waiting room?
Ahora no hay nadie en sala de espera.
No, we don't have anyone on the waiting room so far, but I'll be on the lookout.
شكرا
Thank you. Thank you, dear. Let me welcome you all. Let me start by saying we are happy to join today to the second session of the co-learning space, which HIC provides through the HIC partners, members, and the participants in our second session. Now, the first session was held last week. I welcome you warmly. I would just like to tell you that we have interpretation into French, English, Spanish, and Arabic. You can use any language or listen to any language you prefer. We hope that you write your name on the chat and to change your name to be the name you would like to be known by during this session. Your name, your organization, that would be great. You can also always write in any of the 4 languages on the chat if you have any information you would like to tell us, any question you would like to pose to the participants, because sometimes we have questions that come to mind and that we forget them quickly. Therefore, please write your comments and questions on the chat, and we hope that you do not turn on your mic outside the time you are speaking, because we would like to hear each other well. These are just small instructions to be on the same page and to work well together. Allow me to move to the next page. Today, my dear, as you see in this series of sessions, of 4 sessions, these are the 4 sessions that address the issue of climate change and particularly climate justice. In the first session, we talked in detail about defining climate change and climate justice, what they mean to us, and how the issues of climate change impact climate justice and justice in general. Today, in today's session, which is the second session, we will speak about the framework of international law, how the laws address climate change, how can we see climate change from the perspective of human rights, and the general framework of human rights and its approach, and how can we address this through the human rights and justice approach. There will be a third session. Please don't forget them and join us next week at the same time on Thursday, which will also address the issue of climate justice in terms of the struggles and strategies adopted that we use in order to achieve global solidarity and to take all the context into consideration and work through them. The final session will be held on the 26th of October, this month of October, when we celebrate the World Habitat Day. There are many celebrations this month. And we also use this opportunity to raise the voice about issues of climate and habitat in particular. The fourth session on the 26th of October will address the issue of advocacy. How can we really have strategies? How can we work together? How can we formulate our messages in order to have regional and global advocacy that impacts the local reality of all our countries? This will be in the fourth and last session. Stay with us, and we hope that you join us in the remaining sessions as well. Now, allow me, you are with us now, and we would like for you to tell us or to answer two questions through a tool that we use in Zoom. The first question, which you can answer directly: are you a member of the Habitat International Coalition? If yes or no, please let us know. We want to know how many of those participating with us are members of HIC and how many are not. The second question, what region are you from? Africa, the United States, North America, Latin America, Asia, Europe, or MENA? Where are you joining us today from? Where are you speaking to us from today? We hope that everyone participates. As you see, do you see the results? Does everyone see the results?
No, thanks, Hala. Not yet. I will just give a few more seconds for anyone else to just respond with a yes or no, or with selecting the region that works for you. And then we will end the poll and just see who's in the house with us.
I have admitted some people, so could you explain the survey again?
نعم لدينا
Yes, we have a question now, or two questions that you see on the screen. One question about if you are a member of the Habitat International Coalition. Let us know if the answer is yes or no. Also choose the region you come from, where you are joining us from today. What is the region that you work from? We will give a few seconds for everyone to join us.
Hala, I think we
Hala?
can proceed.
أعتقد أن يمكننا أن نستمر.
Can to appear the response for all?
Sorry, Hala, I missed that.
Did everyone respond?
Yes, majority of us did. Majority of
نعم.
us did,
نعم.
Hala.
دعوني أقول لكم أننا
Let me
لدينا
tell you that we have 77% of the participants who are members of HIC. 23% of you are not members of HIC. We hope that you join us as members. If we look at the regions, we have 19% from Africa, 15% from the MENA region, the Middle East and North Africa, 50% from Latin America. I welcome you all. We have 8% from North America, as well as 8% from Europe. We don't have anyone from Asia. From the Pacific region, we have nobody as well. We are limited to Africa, North America, Latin America, MENA, and Europe. I welcome you all. In the previous session, my dears, we had a number of speakers who gave us a definition of climate change and climate justice. They also spoke to us about how climate justice is an important issue. We were joined by from Latin America, from Argentina, Enrique Viale, who spoke in depth about climate change, its impacts, consequences, and how it became an important environmental issue globally and locally. Also, we were joined by Adriana, who is the president of HIC. She's an expert in urban development, and she is from the Planning and Urban Sustainability at University College in London. She spoke about defining climate justice and its relationship to habitat. And last but not least, we were joined by Priscilla Akchapa, who is a global leader and an activist on the Women Environment Program, who spoke to us about the impact of climate injustice in different regions. She mainly spoke about Africa and how climate injustice can dominate life in Africa in a number of countries. We also posed a question to you about your expectations from these sessions, how you believe they can be beneficial. What are the most prominent topics? The answer through the Mentimeter and also through the chat. Your answers, as you see them on the screen, spoke about learning experiences on climate justice in local popular habitat level, urban or rural areas. You had expectations also for connecting, exchanging, and learning on urban justice and climate justice. You also had expectations related to knowing more about the climate justice, mitigation strategies, adapting, and the best ways through which advocacy can be performed on the national level. You also had an expectation about achieving a common understanding and relationship of the importance of climate justice, getting to know more issues, regional issues having to do with climate justice, and the levels, global levels of addressing these issues. And finally, you also had an aspiration and expectation to speak about advocacy and how we can perform advocacy processes for a more just and more inclusive community and society, which channels into climate justice. This what you expected last time. If we move to what climate justice means to you, that was another question, and we received some important answers, including, for example, it is the approach addressing equality and justice, mitigating the impact of climate change, that the approach should be equal between North and South. Another answer was to link challenges and solutions from the global South and the global North, and therefore we should have joint efforts in addressing these challenges. The third and last answer that we chose was that climate change justice means seeking ways to ensure that climate policies and procedures take into account unique experiences and vulnerabilities of women, men, and workers towards equitable and inclusive solutions that promote sustainability and perseverance for everyone. What you expected and your definitions when you spoke last time, we hope that we go deeper into talking about these issues in the following times through this session and the following sessions. The last thing I would like to share with you is that today in this session, we speak basically about the legal framework. After taking the concepts, we need to deal with the human rights approach within the legal framework, as well as the regional and local laws, not only the global laws and instruments. We have four topics: climate justice as one of the human rights issues, and how we understand the context to determine the international and regional legal frameworks that have to do with climate justice. Third, we will talk mainly about the approach of human rights in the field of advocacy related to climate justice, and how the human rights approach covers climate justice. And fourth, we will talk about the key components of the global and regional policy frameworks that we need to take into consideration in order to develop the advocacy strategy to achieve climate justice in our region, and also our regions and our countries. For this reason, today we are about to listen from lawyers, experts, and those who are working in the human rights field, and how to address the issues from global, regional, and legal and local legal frameworks. I give the microphone to my colleague, Abir Batma, who will be a facilitator. We will also be joined by other facilitators. You will listen to them successively. Abir, welcome everyone. Thank you, Hala. I am very happy to facilitate the second session. I would like to introduce myself. I am Abir Al-Butma. I am a facilitator of the co-learning spaces in the MENA region, Middle East and North Africa. To start with, I would like to share with you, or to share with us, all in answering two questions through the Google Classroom. The first one has to do with if you have any participation in advocacy with relation to climate justice. I ask everyone, all the participants, to join the link to the Google Classroom to answer this question, this first question. We also have the other question that has to do with the national or local laws and the public policies and the instruments having to do with climate justice or climate change. What are the national laws in your countries, public policies that have to do with climate change? I will be happy with the participation of everyone. And I start with some answers. There is a participation from Cameroon with relation to I'm sorry, her voice broke up. With relation to climate justice, they're working on the legal or policies of climate change. This participation was in raising awareness about the danger of plastic waste. This waste is causes pollution, and there is another participation on reviewing the national commitments in Palestine and affirming the implementation of real climate solutions rather than false ones. And the participant is also a member of the Climate Justice and Energy member. There's also participation from Canada, where they participated in a lot of advocacy activities on the regional level.
Abir, you're muted.
Abir is muted.
أعتذر. تمام. أما بخصوص القوانين
As with relation to the national laws and public policies having to do with climate justice, there was a participation contribution from Argentina. The National Congress in Argentina issued the Environmental Law 25/675 on 6 November 2002 to implement sustainable policies and preserve biological diversity. The Argentinian law on climate change, law 27/520 on the minimum budget for adaptation and mitigation of global climate change, which was issued in 2019. It established minimum budget for the adequate management of climate change. There was also another participation from Senegal, where Article 25/2 of the Constitution, which was adopted by referendum in 2016, that everyone has the right to enjoy a healthy environment, and the preservation, the protection, and the improvement with is the responsibility of the public authorities. There was also a participation from Palestine, as Palestine is impacted by climate change and does not impact it. To achieve climate justice in Palestine, the government works within the national contributions and the strategy of climate adaptation. There is a good participation also from civil society and the grassroots level. When we talk about the special case of Palestine and climate justice there, the main threat for justice is the Israeli occupation that prevents and controls all resources, natural resources that restrict Palestinians' ability to cope with climate change. We have also a contribution from Canada. There is a number of policies having to do with climate change on the local and the national levels. One of these policies is the Canadian Act on Net Zero Emissions Accountability, which aims to achieve net zero gas house emissions by 2050. And there's also Law 12/96, dated 5 August 1996, related to the framework on environmental management, establishing the Ministry of Environment in 2005. There's also a participation from Sudan saying we have old laws that were recently modified, and the modification was introduced to address climate change. This was a summary of the participation and answers to the questions. I hope to have not to have overlooked any contributions. Now we move to the first speaker in this session. The speaker is Mr. David Williams, who will give us a presentation talking about climate justice and understanding the context from the human rights context. Mr. David Williams is the director of the Global Climate Justice Program in the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation in New York. Go ahead, Mr. David.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me okay. And thanks for all that lovely, all those lovely inputs, and also for asking me to be here today. It's a real pleasure to speak in front of all of you, and to be speaking next to esteemed colleagues is a real privilege. So thank you very much. I'm here to speak a bit about climate justice as a human rights issue. If it's okay, what I thought would be useful would be to speak about why, first of all, on a very basic level, climate justice is a matter for human rights, and then maybe speak a bit about some recent developments happening in the human rights sphere, and then going on to what impacts that's having in different interpretations of law regarding to climate justice. As introduced, I'm David Williams. I work for the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation on the International Climate Justice Program. I've now been working several years on international climate policy, but I actually started out in climate science, and that would be my academic background. And I know that you've already had sessions on the whole underpinning of climate justice, but just as a very brief sort of reminder of where we are right now. So this is essentially the global greenhouse gas emissions, and sort of shows under sort of current trajectory, under current implemented policies. And that's an if, because there are many very sort of conservative, regressive governments at the moment trying to undo policies for more stringent climate action. But if the implemented policies now stay implemented, we're going to be at around 2.2 to 3.5 degrees warming until the end of the century. And we're already at 1.1 degrees now, and we can see the impacts that those are having. That warming is happening, and local governments are sort of being forced to respond. Local, regional, national governments, and their primary response to this is adaptation. So it's questions of, okay, we have densely built cities. How can we introduce green space to these cities to provide shade for residents? How can we improve water systems and access to water in times of water shortages? How can we better protect coastlines from coastal erosion? How can we better protect low-lying areas from sea level rise? These are all sort of new challenges that governments all across the world are having to deal with right now. And when these climate change impacts happen, sometimes they're so severe, the severity of these impacts go beyond what can be adapted to. And then certainly in the climate policy world, we're speaking of loss and damage. So we're talking about loss of lives, loss of infrastructure, loss of houses, loss of livelihoods, when floods, droughts, and heat waves occurs. And of course, it's most common for the most vulnerable communities and community members to be most impacted by this, because their vulnerability to climate change is much higher, and it's often sort of historically discriminated communities and communities that are on the periphery of society. And that's why it's essential for human rights, because there are several human rights which are directly impacted by this. Article 3, everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of person. Article 23, everyone has the right to work, to free choice of employment, to just and favorable conditions of work, and to protection against unemployment. And also everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and of his family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care. So these are just some of the human rights which are directly impacted by this. And very interestingly, there's been quite an important recent development, was the addition of a new human right, which refers directly to climate change, namely the human right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. This was passed last year in July 2022. It was an initiative led by the Costa Rican representatives here at the UN in New York, and signed by over 100 other states. There were a couple of abstentions, but not too many. And it's really important, because not only are we talking about substantive elements, which include things like the right to clean air, the right to a safe and stable climate, access to safe water, access to safe sanitation. But it also includes procedural elements, as they're known in law. So access to information, for instance, the right to participate in decision-making processes. And also, if one has participated in decision-making processes, then they also have to be free from reprisals or any negative consequences from their participation in them. So it's really key, and I think one of the main hopes is that it provides like an additional legal basis for environmental related cases which have been taken to courts both at the national, the regional, at the international level, to really support this framing of climate change and climate justice as a human rights issue. One area which plays a key role in the international climate policy world, of course, is the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is where essentially sort of global society's response to climate change is negotiated. It's negotiated along the lines of 3 pillars: mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. And human rights is really key for all 3 of these pillars. And I'd just like to show sort of one example in which these kind of decisions have an impact on the negotiations at the UNFCCC. And I'm going to use the Paris Agreement for this, which I think is one of the most well-known pieces of legislation coming out of the UNFCCC process, specifically not around the very famous 1.5 and 2 degree goal, which was agreed upon in Paris, but about the global stocktake, and that's quite important looking towards COP28 in Dubai. And it's essentially every 5 COPs, because it's been 5 COPs now since Paris, there's what's called a global stocktake being undertaken, where all the nationally determined contributions of the different countries in an effort to achieve the 1.5 degree goal are assessed, also in an effort to enhance adaptive capacity of their respective countries. And what happens then is a proposition text gets input by the lead negotiators. And in this case, and this is the most recent text, which was released on the 8th of September, it actually has a direct reference to human rights, which on the surface might sound like a good thing if it just references all human rights, but actually civil society organizations always advocate for something slightly more stringent. And civil society, of course, gets to respond to this initial text. And this is the submission from the Climate Change and Human Rights Working Group, who advocate for the inclusion of the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, which directly refers to this judgment. A couple of other very interesting policy developments which have been impacted by this. I'm going to just highlight two. One is the right of the child in the context of environment and climate change. So there's this committee on the rights of the child within the UN, and they've essentially come to the decision that governments must respond to growing concerns expressed by children and young people about the effects of the climate crisis on their lives. They can't just not do anything about it. They have to respond. They have the duty to safeguard, as it's put in the outcome text, to safeguard a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, acknowledging that it is both a human right itself and necessary for the full enjoyment of a broad range of children's rights. Similarly, we also have the Maastricht principles on the human rights of future generations, which again is a group of around sort of 60, I think it's 60 or 70, 60 or 70 sort of leading legal experts in human rights and climate change, including sort of former UN special rapporteurs, who really sort of have endorsed this principle as a document which clarifies and presents the state of international law as it applies to the human rights of future generations. And again, here in the preamble, we have Article 14, which states that this context includes the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. So these are just a couple of examples of how these big decisions made at the international level can sort of seep into other areas. And I'd just like to highlight a couple of cases which go away from this international level and take it a bit more down to the national and the regional level, because sometimes everything sort of in this sort of UN world can seem a bit abstract. So one is a German example, actually. This actually happened a few years ago, where German youth groups actually sued the government of Germany. The government of Germany said that they're going to make significant efforts to reduce greenhouse gases from 2031. And the argument of the youth groups was that this was too late, and that it gave older generations an unfair advantage in terms of burning fossil fuels, which would then make younger generations have to implement a decarbonization of the economy much faster than they would have to if this aim would be pulled forward. And they were actually given, they were actually, well, they won in front of the German Constitutional Court, and the German government was forced to change its CO2 reduction plans going forward. And this is a really, really good example of I think the application of this kind of law, of the way it can be applied in the court. Another one is very recent, which is the case of Montana youths. And there again, you know, Montana is a major coal and gas producing state. It gets 1/3 of its energy from burning coal, which is quite horrendous. And youths, with a very similar argument, actually went to the courts and said that this was not fair because you're taking away the constitutional right to a healthy environment. And they were also given, they also won, and now companies in Montana have to take climate change damage into consideration when approving new projects. It's going to be taken to the Supreme Court, and the constitution of the Supreme Court right now doesn't give us a lot of optimism that this will be upheld, but we'll see. We'll see how things develop. It's also to be seen within a wider context of a real increase in climate change litigation This is a map of the US and all these different lawsuits which are being filed against fossil fuel companies directly. And I think the US is a great place to do this because it is the headquarter. It does house many of the headquarters of these really, really horrible fossil fuel companies. Just to give you an idea of how this is really sort of increasing this sort of issue of litigation and how it is being supported by these by the legislation being met at the international level as well. And one other thing, I started off in climate science, and I thought I'd end with climate science. I hope that's okay. One other thing which is really changing the litigation landscape is attribution side. So essentially the ability to take a specific climate change extreme event and link it straight to emissions. So with heat, it's quite simple. You can say, you know, if there's been a heat wave somewhere, it was made X percentage more likely and X percentage more intense directly by climate change. Drought, it's a bit more complicated, rain as well, but the methods, the statistical analysis behind this is really improving. And it's being, like, we're seeing it being used more and more in court cases, particularly against fossil fuel companies. And I think that can only really be conceived as a positive thing. I'd like to end here with the Global Climate March, which we had in New York very recently, which is where I'm based. Just to sort of show, I think that there is, like, the legal framework is hopefully creating some momentum that we can hold those account who are causing the crisis that we're in. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much. And yeah, I look forward to discussing further.
Thank you so much, David, for this very important overview of frameworks and cases in which we already have climate justice in the UN system or within national policies or legislation. People, hello. For those who doesn't know me, my name is Enrique. I'm also a co-facilitator of this space on climate justice. I'm very happy to be here and share this responsibility with my friends. And right now we have 10 minutes for a moment of question and answers for those who want to react on what David presented to us. So I suggest, if you want to make a comment or make a question to David, we can give the floor to 3 people or 4 people. You can raise your hand so I can see if you want to speak. I think I see Dr. Marie raised her hand. Yes, Dr. Marie. Yes, so I'll begin with Dr. Marie and then Desmond. Please, Dr. Marie.
Merci pour ce brillant exposé.
Thank you for this brilliant presentation, Mr. David. He spoke about climate change in line with human rights, and in his presentation, he spoke about mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage or reparations linked to effects of climate change. My question is a bit particular on an element we do not speak about a lot, on the dignity of the human, dignity of the individual. How can we move from this formal framework on this theoretical framework that's already written down in order to guarantee through climate change or the fight against climate change to restore human dignity? In Cameroon, we had a recent landslide and flooding, and people have been left in despair. There are people who have been displaced and their environment was completely destroyed. They lost everything, including their dignity. So in our advocacy, which we are carrying out, can we also not insist on this idea of human dignity, which transcends all limitations and all barriers to finding climate justice that we have been fighting for a long time? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Marie. I'll give the floor to Desmond, please.
Thank you very much, Enrique and David, for great presentation. I think you have shown clearly that we do not lack in terms of policies and legal instruments to implement the climate change issues. But my concern is that with all the instruments and policies in place, the implementation is the big issue to push forward. And the key issue is that all these international convention and instruments are voluntary and not really binding to the member state. So you see member states sign in and but comes back without implementing all this, and nothing is done about it. My question is that do you think we should start advocating in line to see that they are binding, or they are issues that we can hold the member state accountable for what they have signed into? I give reference to the presentation of Dr. Priscilla for the first session, which she talked about with reference to the communities, and particularly for African countries. You see, whereby in search of water, you see people are perforating the environment continuously, each person trying to have a borehole on its own, and leading to over-perforation of the environment, and that will have a very strong impact on the environment in the future. So why the public, the public institution fails to make provision for this, or try to see how they can stop this kind of practice going on. So I want, from your experience, what do you think that will be the solution in this situation that we find ourselves in? Thank you.
Thanks to you, Desmond. And Adriana also wants to make a question for David. Please, Adriana, go ahead.
Gracias, Enrique. Great to see you again, David, and many thanks for the presentation. And I'm glad I'm not in your shoes to respond to these very, very tough questions. But building upon the points raised by Desmond and also Marie, I just wonder if you could give us a sense of how extensively you see any trends that you see in terms of the use of the forms of litigation that you have described, the new windows for climate litigation, and also the impact of science, attribution science, not just in, let's say, in the global north for a short term, but across the global south. Do you really see an expansion of the avenues to fight for climate justice through these means or not? Thank you.
Thanks, Adriana. I'll give the part to Yolande, and with Yolande, we can close this moment to give the floor back to David. Okay, Yolande, please.
Sure, thank you, Enrique. I'll be very quick. In our last session, David, we started, so this was last week, we started thinking and talking about the relationship between climate justice and habitat, and land and housing in particular. Sort of in the different frameworks you had mentioned, this is not necessarily explicitly obvious. And I'm just wondering whether you could perhaps point us in the direction of how we can see that intersection between these two matters, particularly when it comes to global legal instruments. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Yolande. David, I know there are some challenges in these questions. We don't expect you to give us the solutions, but your opinion on what people commented. So you have 3 minutes and a half to do that. But people, I'm just kidding. We'll have another 2 moments of question and answer. So I hope David can stay with us until the end of the session so we can come back to the debate. after having Dr. Marie, Kelly, and Eric as well. David, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. They're really difficult questions, as highlighted by Adriana. But I will do my best to respond to them as best I can. So on Marie's question around human dignity, this is actually like the way I'm going to respond to this is predominantly through the climate change negotiations and how it's dealt in that space. And there, in the discussion around loss and damages, there's a term which is increasingly becoming more important, which is known as non-economic loss and damages. So it's losses and damages which occur in communities which can't be quantified. The loss of cultural grounds, of spiritual grounds, of heritage. These are things that you can't really put a price tag on, and how are we going to deal with this? Particularly, it's the most clearly with rising sea levels in coastal areas. So that's how it's dealt with in there, and there's a lot of advocacy around it, how to compensate for that. Unfortunately, the direction it's going in right now is that there will somehow have to be a price tag put on it, because some of these losses and damages are unavoidable, or are seen as unavoidable by the global community. I would argue they are avoidable, of course. But yeah, and I think it's really important, particularly right now within the climate change negotiations, while this loss and damage fund is being created, and the administrative procedures for this fund are being decided upon by the member states, to advocate for the importance of recognizing non-economic losses and damages within the international climate policy framework. To Desmond, on the implementation, that's the classic question to which unfortunately I don't have the right answer. I mean, it's the classic problem. We talk about this within the UNFCCC process as well the whole time, because member states agree to things, and these agreements are binding. Everything that's decided at these COPs are binding. There's just no way to police that, because it's international law, and there's no sort of international implementation institute or something. We can use these agreements as advocacy organizations to try and hold our governments to account, and highlight that they're not sticking to what they agreed to. But that's also something where I think these different bits of legislation that I talked about do play an important role, and do facilitate that process of holding our governments to account. But yeah, the implementation of human rights on the ground is a huge issue, and it's not just in terms of climate change where human rights are being disregarded completely. Yeah. I'm running out of time. I realize that, but just briefly on Adriana's question on the expansion of this legal framework to include both sort of global north and global south regions, I would differentiate a bit between mitigation and adaptation and loss and damage, because I think mitigation is something where the focus is more on global north regions and countries, just because global north are the main fossil fuel emitters, and that's where the headquarters of most fossil fuel companies are based. So I think it's understandable that that's the case. With the issue of loss and damage and adaptation, I mean, the huge question, of course, is who pays for this, because I think it's absolutely disgraceful that global south countries are right now being asked to borrow more money at horrendous interest rates to adapt to a problem which they haven't caused themselves. And of course, in the UNFCCC, global north countries have advocated very long that the provision of loss and damage finance does not equate to liability or compensation, as it says in the text. So it's not, while these things are being framed by some as reparations, this sort of the issue of loss and damage finance, the actual implementation of it at the UNFCCC has nothing to do with reparations. Real reparations would look very, very differently than what's happening at the moment. And I think there actually there are some encouraging signs that the courts could provide an answer to that. There's the famous case of the Peruvian farmer who is suing Germany's largest energy company. And there again, the use of attribution science is facilitating that process. And yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see how that court case pans out, because they often give an indication of how other court cases might pan out. And then to Yolanda's point about the issue of habitat and which global legal instruments might be useful for that. It's a huge issue which doesn't receive enough attention, is what I can say. It exacerbates the housing crisis and the housing issue that many residents face, and I think it's one of the most important applications of climate justice. Actually, if we have a look at IPCC reports, they all say the population group which is going to be most affected by climate change impact is urban residents. That's where the highest form of vulnerability is going to be concentrated. Cities are expanding, particularly in coastal areas of the global south, which is exactly where climate change extremes are going to hit the strongest. And this sort of coming until the end of the century is going to be a huge problem. Unfortunately, this is an area where international legislation lacks any real answers, I would say, and it's sort of seen as a local issue. And local frameworks need to provide the answer for that. Local courts, regional courts need to decide on what to do, because this sort of issue of mitigation is a very global thing. Adaptation and loss and damage is sort of seen more as a local problem. And I think that's one explanation as to why the international policy framework is so behind on this. Yeah, I hope I've done that sort of okay. And yeah, thank you very much. Those are really hard questions.
Great. Thank you very much, David. I think you did wonderfully with the time you had. Thank you so much for your presentation and the answers. We are going now to move to the second part of our session. Just to remind you, I saw Priscilla had raised her hand. We are still going to have 2 other moments of question and answer. So Priscilla, you are invited to comment after we hear from Dr. Mahi and Kelly, and then we'll have Eric and also another moment of question and answers and exchange. So thank you very much for understanding. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Marie Nonga. Thank you very much for being with us today, Dr. Mahi. Dr. Mahi is Doctor in Environmental Law, a lecturer at the Faculty of Legal and Political Sciences of the University of Yaoundé. Second, she is doctor with many years of experience in the analysis and assessment of environmental risks related to the exploitation of marine and coastal resources in the Gulf of Guinea in general and specifically in Cameroon. Dr. Marie has a lot of researches and she will help us on the topic on how to use the human rights approach in advocacy related to climate justice. Thank you so much, Dr. Marie. The floor is yours.
C'est bon, tout le monde m'entend? D'accord. Merci.
Great. Thank you for giving me the floor once again. I will present on the determination of regional and international legal frameworks on climate justice. As we followed briefly on the summary that was given, climate justice goes beyond ethical considerations in order to ask questions on the legality and the justiciability of this climate justice. Formally, it wishes to establish the impact of human activity on the environment and the attendant causes. This new approach has been promoted by NGOs whose manifest desire is to find a means of control and respect by governments on their commitments to climate change, failure to which they will be subject to sanctions that are imposed by the UNFCCC. But climate change problems are not only on interstate or state entities, especially for their work in climate change. It also targets companies who are the first in terms of pollution and other effects of climate change. And in my presentation, we are going to look at the sources and the obligations in line with climate change. I followed the question on the texts on climate change, and I hope that this question will be answered. Now, climate change agreements, when we talk about the sources, we look at the legal basis on how advocacy on climate change will be done in order to be able to present petitions within a legal framework. While contemplating climate justice and its issues, we see that it has content which is relative. It varies from country to country and context to context, and we still do not have the mastery of this idea. And on the legal side, we have also found out there are many actions are done not by invoking climate justice as a notion or an idea by itself, but looking at it as a part of respecting environmental rights. So advocacy works mostly on behalf of human rights or environmental rights, or respecting of rights, especially the rights of livelihoods by humans. Now, there are several sources that constitute the legal basis of these requests that are made. There exist several appropriate legal instruments. Countries have laws and policies that speak about certain aspects of the climate problem, and the Paris Climate Agreement has listed a list of national commitments to avoid increase of global temperatures beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius. Analysis of global litigation enables us to understand that legal international instruments serve as a basis to fight for climate justice, and the implementation of environmental law in different countries is where the problem lies. In several frameworks, the actions of the government have constitutional and statutory references that are not specifically linked, and they do not expressly state climate change, but enables us to arrive at climate justice if they are properly implemented. So references to international climate accords just speak about scientific engagements as well as policy engagements in terms of fighting for climate change. Now, because of time, we are going to move a bit quickly, and then to do the Q&A, we will come back to it. So there are several international binding instruments on climate justice. In a nutshell, we have the universal instruments such as international law and instruments that are legally binding. The first is the UNFCCC, UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, that charted the path on fight against climate-related issues. And this was the first milestone of climate considerations, and its preamble, it speaks about the principle of common concern for humanity and the challenges it faces concerning climate. The Kyoto Protocol also borrowed a leaf from the UNFCCC, and it wasn't legally binding as we had wished in the international scene. Then we have the Paris Climate Agreement. These are three of the most common international instruments that we are aware of. And with the 2016 Paris Agreement, this is the first instrument that has deepened and gone in depth on the issues of international coordination and action and decision-making concerning greenhouse gas emissions, and insists on the collective nature of the fight that we need to carry out against climate change. So today, We have seen a convergence of actions following the adoption of the Paris Climate Accord at the Paris COP in 2015. It also insists to human rights and all connected rights therein. Besides the universal frameworks that are there that specifically concern climate, we have regional frameworks, but these regional frameworks in Africa, this regional African framework focuses the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, which was the first legal instrument in the world to link the right to the environment as a human right. This was the first text on the international scene that consecrated specifically the right to a healthy environment as a human right. And so it made this a human right expressly in its document. Besides this legally binding document, you also have other environmental law instruments that have been developed. If you look at climate change litigation, you will see that most of these litigations are based on the instruments linked to rights based on environmental rights and law that have changed over time and gotten more improvements. The main things that we have seen are instruments based on human rights, as we saw David spoke about previously, spoke about human rights as a source on protection of climate-related rights and climate justice rights. There is a right to a clean, healthy environment that is included in many international constitutional instruments and even community instruments, which is the pillar, because through the right to a healthy, clean environment, this is the appropriate and satisfactory framework that enables us to conduct all advocacy on climate justice related issues today. Then you also have people who claim their rights based on negligence that is part of common law, which is in legal precedents, and it is supported by constitutions of several states with internal laws of countries. And besides these binding documents, we have non-binding instruments, which are policy documents, statements, summits, meetings between different stakeholders and communities, and different resolutions adopted regarding climate change. So, the implementation of all these legal instruments is also dependent on tools developed by different stakeholders, including environmental impact assessments, which catalyzes all prevention actions, because prevention actions in climate change are paramount. Environmental impact assessments, you will find environmental management programs. And to come back to climate change issues, you have observatories. Many countries have created climate change observatories to be able to analyze the changes and the effects of climate change in each country. All these tools and resources contribute to the fight against climate change. However, it should be noted that today, the risks and the effects of climate change, despite this buzz, has not really achieved much results. Now I will stop there because I know time is far gone, and I'll wait for your questions and answers.
Thank you very much, Dr. Marie. It was perfect, perfect timing. I'll also call the next speaker. I would like to introduce Kelly Agopian, who is my colleague from Policy Institute in Brazil, also a HIC member. And Kelly is also member of the support team of the Global Platform for the Right to the City. Kelly right now is a postdoctoral researcher at the Global Cities program at the University of São Paulo in Brazil, in which she's developing a research project on gender and the right to the city. Kelly has more than 10 years of experience with local human rights practice and research, including working during 3 years in the local government of São Paulo. Kelly will also help us to reflect on how we can use the human rights approach in advocacy related to climate justice. Kelly, I'm very happy to see you here today, to have you here today with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Henrique. Thank you all for being here with me. I'm learning a lot from my colleagues. Thank you so much, Henrique, for your invitation and for me to be here. And I hope I can bring you some contribution on our recent reflections on this topic. I'm going to share my screen. I hope you can see my screen, my presentation.
Yes.
Yes. So I'm Kelly, and I'm going to present on how to use the human rights approach in advocacy related to climate justice. Well, let me just, okay. I don't know if I can make it bigger. Well, I think that it's also very important, firstly, to contextualize what we are talking about and why we're talking about a human rights topic when addressing climate change, environmental events. So here I brought you three main components that I consider as also central and demonstrate how human rights are interconnected to climate change action. So here, currently we have a current mode of production of urban space that do not guarantee the right to adequate housing and the right to basic services for everyone. This is an image from a São Paulo favela, where you can see that we have the real estate interests put beyond the human rights and the communitarian interests. We now have also this urban immobility, I would say, context, also here in São Paulo, in Brazil, where we prioritize highly polluting motorized individual modes of transport. These also have some impact on unequal patterns of use of time. So those who spend hours on the traffic trying to do your journey to work and into your house, they spend a lot of time and they cannot use it for example, leisure and other formation, capacitation, and educational uses. We have also respiratory diseases, and all of these are also a human rights topic. Finally, we have an urban solid waste management context where we still have a framework based on landfills, where there is high emissions of greenhouse gases, and we know also where those landfills are usually located, usually next to peripheral and marginalized communities that suffer most from these emissions. So I think that this example of São Paulo is important for us to illustrate why we have to use this human rights approach in advocacy for a climate justice action, because I think that this is an example of how, for example, Instituto Polis developed an evidence-based information, tried to disseminate it for a bigger audience, not only for academia, and how we can develop data collection and product an information that is well accessible for everyone. So here we can see on our left the context of São Paulo, where we have the concentration of Black population on the peripheries. We have also the concentration of lower household incomes in the peripheries, also households whose providers are women with income up to 1.5 minimum wage, which means around $400, and we have more inadequate sewage provision also on the peripheries. And here we have in this bigger map, this geological risk areas. So here which means that we have higher probability of the incidence and occurrence of landslides and soil erosion. So we can see it's also on the peripheries. So that is why we call it, we say that we are living in a context of climate justice. Why? Because we know that climate extreme events do not affect everyone the same way. We have to take into consideration aspects such as race, class, gender, territory, because those aspects influence in how people are exposed to these events and how they can prevent and recover from their negative effects. So we saw on the last slide that the people with lower incomes are concentrated on the areas where we have higher occurrence of geological incidents. So how they will recover from these incidents. So here is what we have is called environmental races. Here, this image shows us a coastal city in the state of São Paulo, São Sebastião, which suffered from heavy rain in February 2023, but all of those populations were already living in poor housing conditions. So this caused all these landslides, and now there are hundreds of people without proper housing and proper homes, fighting until now, 6 months later, that this happened. When you think about solutions based on human rights, we mean that solutions to climate change that do not consider those intersectional social inequalities are not real solutions. Solutions that violate human rights are not real solutions and not effective solutions. Mitigation and adaptation should be centered on the collective well-being of people and communities, which means that solutions are collective, are built in a collective perspective, not in an individual way. And here I quote Fernando Delgado from the International Network for Economic and Social and Cultural Rights that was invited by the platform in an event we made addressing climate justice. And he says, the difficulty is in changing models and understanding that climate change is a problem of injustice, not about particles in the air. And what would be a human rights-based approach? Well, I think I'm going to reaffirm what my colleagues mentioned just before, because here when we are using a human rights-based approach, I think we have to use all the instruments, all the support we have in our hands. So here is the institutional acknowledgement of environment as also a human right. So as my colleagues mentioned, we first had a Human Rights Council resolution on this, on recognizing the right to a sustainable environment. And then afterwards, we have the General Assembly adopting a resolution on the same topic. So this came through a human rights perspective in the first place. And this means that states should ensure a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment in order to respect human rights. At the same time, states should respect human rights in order to ensure healthy and sustainable environment. So they are interdependent. Well, here also, as key messages brought by the Human Rights High Commissioner for Human Rights, a human rights-based approach on climate change should consider that mitigation, any kind of mitigation action should prevent also the negative human rights impacts of climate change. We have to ensure that everyone has the capacity to adapt to climate change. We have to ensure that we have accountability, reparation, remedies for human rights harms caused by climate change. We have to protect human rights from corporation and business harms, guarantee equality and non-discrimination, and also ensure meaningful and informed participation. And all of these, we have to focus on most vulnerable groups because we have differentiated impacts on differentiated vulnerable groups. So this differentiated action can be a a good way to access to equality results. So it's not extensive list, but I can mention women and girls, indigenous peoples, homeless, racialized groups, coastal population, and those undertaking formal jobs, displaced people, also inner displaced people, not only international displaced people, migrants, rural population, urban poor, the elderly. Finally, I think that one key aspect that we are trying to mobilize through the Global Platform for the Right to the City is to mobilize the right to the city as a common denominator for climate justice, because the right to the city is based on a human rights approach and also brings this localization of climate justice action. So how we can take into account territorial aspects dealing with climate vulnerability. So how can we connect the housing rights demands and the habitat rights demands to all this discussion, how we can strengthen urban-rural linkages, and how we can collectively build solutions through a participatory process. And here we have also, I think that is key when we try to mobilize the right to the city in this aspect of climate justice, is to connect exactly the efforts of people who are already working with environmental issues, but not focusing on the territory, on the local, and those who are already working in the urban issues, but do not address all the environmental and climate risks. So how can we join all those efforts and strengthen their action? And here we have this Right to the City, a roadmap for climate justice thematic paper of the Global Platform for the Right to the City, which brings a little bit all of this discussion on the right to the city and climate justice. So thank you very much. Here is a poster calling for Brazil with climate justice and without disasters. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kelly. Just to keep everybody aware that this material of the Global Platform is going to be shared with you all. Thank you. Kelly, you can stop. Okay, great. Now we have the opportunity of having another moment.
Ahora tenemos otra oportunidad para tener una sesión.
The questions and answers, so we can do the same way. 3 people or 4 people having comments and questions for Dr. Marie and Kelly. Priscilla had her hand raised on the first moment. So Priscilla, if you want to go ahead, the floor is yours now.
Great presentations, both from David, from Marie. I listened very much attentively. My comment was actually on some of the questions that were asked in terms of parties signing these agreements and not implementing them back home. I just wanted to add that there is a need to intensify advocacy by all of us. Yes, parties go there to go and make up promises and sign these agreements, but most of them are not enforced or are not implemented when they come back to the countries. And so what we need to do as activists is to see how we can engage the parties and begin to take up these issues with them, because it's not just enough to go and make empty promises and come back and not do it. So, and that is where we need a very strong movement, both at the national level and at the regional level. So this is very important. But I also wanted to talk about the issues of loss and damage fund, which I know that David tried to kind of provide an eloquent answer to it. For us in Africa, we're really worried about the issues of loss and damage fund because it means more debt for us. And that is not what we fought for. What we fought for was that the countries, the developed countries, should be able to fulfill their promises to the developing countries of the $100 billion every year. That is not being done. And therefore, it's just like you said, okay, you have pestered us for a long time. Now we are giving you loss and damage fund. It's like opening a bank account for us, but how that bank account is being funded is left for us. And so we are advocating that that is not enough to give us loss and damage fund. The mechanism to funding that loss and damage fund is very important to us. We don't want loans, we want grants, and we want funds that will trickle down to the grassroots, because in all of this, it is the grassroots that are suffering, the people that are being marginalized, the communities, these people that are being displaced, the rural-urban shift, and the people in the what they call in the slum areas are the ones that are suffering. A lot of damages is being done everywhere. So we need a fund that will address the inequalities that we are seeing in the countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Priscilla. Guillermo, creo que sí. Guillermo es siguiente. Adelante.
Hola, sí, buenos días.
Hello, good morning. It's a pleasure to hear you and listen to what you just said. My question is about companies and corporations. Just like the doctor said, for us, it is important to highlight the restrictions available in the production of economy. More often than not, these are the root causes of climate injustices. What's the link between corporations and climate problems? In our organization, just to give you an example, a group of colleagues works on the production of salt, and they have become a cooperative doing a small collection on a small scale. But collecting a lot of producers, they collect lime for pavements and roads and highways. However, they are being displaced from their activities because after a big multinational corporation gets created and they become a superpower in the activity, and they start producing on a different scales using different methods that are super aggressive to the environment. This can be translated into other activities and other regions. We are well aware of those available in our territories and see what their negative impacts are. In this case, my question is, should we only work on mitigation, or can we also work on prevention by establishing caps to limit the intromission of corporations present in different nations, working on extractivism and extraction, affecting nature, affecting also natural resources that are renewable and non-renewable? Thank you.
Gracias, Guillermo. Thank you, Guillermo. I don't see another hand. Does anyone else want to comment or make a question? I also want to highlight what Musa Khan. Hi, Musa. Happy to have you here today also. Musa also commented about reparation and the issue of human rights, if reparation also is included in the human rights framework. Yolande, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Enrique. Just a question or a comment, maybe just in response to Kelly's presentation. I think what you're sharing with us around the right to the city as a human rights-based approach to advocating for climate justice was very interesting. I think also you made quite explicit also that link again between climate justice and habitat, which is obviously also what we in HIC are particularly interested in focusing on. I'm wondering if you can tell us about sort of existing advocacy approaches, perhaps, that you are aware of used by civil society in relation to climate justice. Thanks.
Thanks, Yolande. I'll give the floor back to Dr. Marie and Kelly, maybe 3.5 minutes for each one. You can share the time. Dr. Marie, please.
Alors, merci.
Right, thank you for giving me the floor. I will answer to Guillermo's question. I believe that was addressed to me, if I'm not mistaken, since the others were just comments. I will respond to Guillermo's question, who's asking, what is the existing link between climate justice, actually between companies and climate justice issues? In other terms, how can civil society act against big corporations? What is the legal basis they can use in order to be able to challenge companies concerning climate justice? Is that the question? If that is the question, I will answer as follows. Climate justice is a notion, as I repeated, it's versatile. It is a notion that law has a difficulty in interpreting, and when the law has a difficulty in interpretation, the legal system as constructed right now has issues with climate justice, because this is not an idea that has fixed content. It is transnational, it has intergenerational and long-term effects. And everything that is long-term has a lot of challenges in ordinary justice as is conceived by ordinary legal systems. But besides this difficulty, there are multiple things that contribute to the success of fighting these industries on extractives. I will invite Guillermo to read the article that will appear soon in the African Review on Environmental Rights, and it talks about the delinquency linked to extractive activities, delinquency generated by extractive industries. It has a few solutions that we have proposed in the article. What are some of the difficulties that citizens can be faced with? The first difficulty is that to lead a litigation, you need an interest to fight for. And this interest is not always perceptible. It is not always easy to interpret it on climate justice. Aside from the interest, you have the difficulty in finding who is liable or who is responsible for climate justice, because the effects are long-term. There is no immediate effect, but it's in the longer term, meaning the consequences can come years later, which makes it a bit difficult to develop a causal link between the causes of the work of multinationals and effects of climate change. That is why I've spoken about the difficulty of law in discussing the idea of universality and irreversibility in our constitutionalism. Our current legal systems are not built to define it, but several litigations have succeeded because they referred on environmental law, because environmental law has human rights and respects human life, meaning we need not have some coherence and some consistency in order just to go to court. You can talk about the emissions of smoke and pollution, and it can be justified by using environmental law and environmental rights. But many companies, with the innovations they have, they invest a lot of resources in law to avoid responsibilities for climate justice, because they have strong lobby groups in order to stop the adoption of climate-related norms. They are powerful and they do a lot to escape the responsibility on their liability to climate justice. So it's on us to find mechanisms that are much more acceptable. We need to have a system and continue advocacy through litigation, and the more legal precedents will develop and come out, we will be able to have much more success in the long term, since there are people who have taken these multinationals to court and succeeded. But we know that these multinationals are powerful and some are protected, but there's the principle of environmental responsibilities that these multinationals hide behind to avoid their climate justice responsibilities. Now I'll give Kelly the floor so that she can respond to the time that's left. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Marie. Kelly, if you want to react on the comments and questions.
Yeah, maybe just to not take so much time, maybe the comment of Yolande. I think that maybe we have living an experimental intent here in Brazil. Maybe afterwards Henrique can also bring his contribution on this topic, because we are developing here in Brazil this non-racist adaptation network, which brings together lots of organizations in Brazil, collectives, and most of them, part of them, were mobilized to be part of this network because of the image I showed you of the coastal city in São Sebastião that suffer a lot of with the raining periods and the landslides, but not only in the south of state of São Paulo. The whole country are suffering, the communities are suffering from this climate change, different catastrophic events based on the heavy rainy. And I think that it's an intent that is very recent. Henrique is part of this articulation that is trying to throughout the country mobilize this non-racist perspective on climate, on addressing climate justice. I heard that they are building a strategic planning for the next years on how they can do these incidents, political incidents. And I know that this is also being advanced in somehow in a parallel way in the coast of São Paulo, also with the participation of Instituto Polis, by dialoguing and empowering the coastal communities that suffered from all those landslides, and engaging also the judicial power and the communities to claim for housing rights and for adaptation in this context of climate change events. So we have some examples in Brazil. They are under development, but I think that we can bring you the results, the first results in the few months that follow.
Thank you, Kelly. I think we can share after the class, after our session in the Google Classroom. And it's also a good way to stimulate you to access the Google Classroom and also share the experiences you have regarding legislation, advocacy in your countries. Thank you so much for bringing this Brazilian experience as well. So let's move on. At last but not least, we invited Dr. Eric Shu to help us on a reflection of the key components of global and regional policy frameworks that we need to consider as we develop HIC's climate justice advocacy strategy. So for this moment, we asked Dr. Eric to help us with this reflection on how our coalition can develop a climate justice advocacy strategy. Dr. Eric is a adjunct professor at the University of California, Davis, where he was, until last July, the co-director of the Adaptation Research Center at the same university. He is a global leader in the fields of climate change, social equity, and justice. local and regional planning, and global environmental governance. Dr. Eric has projects that have contributed to significant policy knowledge and social impact through more than 80 published reports and papers, including he was an author for the IPCC last year's report. So Eric, thank you so much for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's great to be here. It's really a privilege to learn and hear from all of the expertise here. As Enrique mentioned, my name is Eric Chu. I am currently in Davis, California, which is on the occupied territories of the Patwin people, one of the many indigenous First Nations groups here in California. I don't have slides, unfortunately, but I'll try my best. I was on a project trip to China over the past couple of weeks, and some of you know that accessing internet resources in China is challenging. I was a bit anxious at the beginning, having to speak to such an esteemed group of practitioners and researchers, and to come last in the series of presenters. But luckily, I think there might be some resonance and some connections to many of the points that everyone has raised already. I was asked to say a couple words on the key components of global and regional policy frameworks that we need to consider to develop HIC's climate justice advocacy strategy. And how I would answer that is through maybe repurposing that question into two smaller questions. The first one is, what are those components and how do we identify those? And I have three answers to that that's coming up. And the second part of this sub-question is who is responsible for designing, implementing efforts to tackle those components, and who is responsible for evaluating successes or failures. And I think those two sub-questions are related, and you'll see as I progress along the next couple of minutes that I'll try to have the two answer each other as we go. And so what are the components? I think reflecting on what I've heard today and based on my own research and teaching experience, which primarily draws on my work with local governments in Asia and the South Pacific, which I know very little representation in our event today. So I guess you'll just have to take my word for it. The first component is having a strong social footing in our advocacy of climate justice in policy and regulatory settings. And this strong social footing is really a distillation of everything that I've heard from all of us here today. How does climate justice affect the everyday quality of life of people, many of whom live on the front lines of climate change? A social footing that considers the diverse life experiences, histories, backgrounds, identities, economic, political statuses of the people. And very often these identities intersect, and intersect in a way that possibly magnifies injustice. And so one way to make climate justice more tangible in policy and regulatory settings, especially if we're pushing towards this implementation gap that many of us have referred to, that we have a lot of ideals, we have a lot of vocabulary around climate justice, but this big question mark around implementation. Well, one way of pushing towards implementation is to socialize this. What does climate justice mean to the day-to-day quality of life concerns for frontline communities? It's water, it's health, it's education, it's housing, it's transportation. Our examples from Brazil, from Cameroon, all talk about these day-to-day quality of life issues, but doing it in a particular way, a quality of life that takes us away from the history of extractive development And we have a lot of experience, a lot of ideas for that already. And so advocates are one really promising avenue is to push in this direction. How do we socialize, embed climate justice in policy and regulatory frameworks that get us to these quality of life issues, but does it in a way that moves us away from extractive development? Second, the second footing is a resourcing footing. Lots of conversation I've heard around loss and damage. Absolutely important. It's not the only resourcing question that matters out there, but when we're talking about climate change, mitigation, or adaptation, a lot of money is involved. Some money will come from the redistribution of resources from global north to global south, just generally transfer of capacity, technology, and money. Clearly, we must face the facts. Either there's not enough or there's not enough political will to actually realize those commitments. So, climate justice advocates have a role to think about innovative ways of resourcing. We all know our communities, we all know our governments. What are some different ways of pooling or steering money or finding money? Is it nonprofits, philanthropy? Is it the private sector? What is it? Some countries may have loans. I don't recommend loans for everyone, maybe not even for anyone, but we have a resourcing footing. Advocates can push in this direction to think about innovative forms of money to support these really big ticket items, especially when we're talking about building big infrastructure, moving, resettling entire communities, or building big productive, protective seawalls, pipes, putting in giant wetlands and rainforests, et cetera, et cetera. The third thing that, the third and final footing point is a spatial footing, which connects to HIC's ongoing conversation on habitat and housing. At the end of the day, climate justice is about safe, sustainable, resilient shelters, homes, where people live and can work and can play and can enjoy their social networks and their families and friends. Basically, a lot of us are asking for that. And so advocates have a role to play in advancing this spatial footing in climate justice because they are place-based. Many of our advocates are locally led by nonprofits, community agents, mobilizers that know their communities in and out and have history in the place. And so there is no better place to have this spatial footing. What goes where? Who makes decisions about what kinds of infrastructure is sited and placed where? Who gets to say what kinds of development, what kinds of housing, what kinds of economic activities are located where? Those essentially are land and space-based questions, and our advocates are really well equipped to do that. And so in the last 2 minutes I've been asked to raise an example. And the best example that I come up with is in California. Well, the one example that I come up with is in California. So take that with a grain of salt. This is California after all. In California, we have a transformative climate communities program, which some of you may be familiar with, which is a California state sponsored, designed program with the explicit intention of channeling money, often tens of millions of US dollars, into historically disadvantaged, low wealth, majority communities here in California. The money comes from our state's cap and trade program, our emissions, long-range emissions reductions program, which generates a lot of money in our case, and with the explicit priority of redistributing that money into low-income, low-wealth communities and giving low-income communities the power, autonomy of decision-making power. They get to decide what to do with that money. And communities, examples abound here. Communities decide to invest in public transportation, in public housing, trees and green space, protective coastline infrastructure, school lunch programs, refurbishing their libraries and community centers. But it's an effort to mobilize communities, to have them take charge of the quality of life issues in the context of climate, but have the resources be distributed in a way that actually fulfills the redistributive priority that climate justice advocates have been talking about for so many years. I could talk a lot more about these programs, but I'll leave it there, and hopefully that was a good summary of all the conversations that we've had so far.
Thank you so much, Eric. Adriana just sent at the chat the link to the program you spoke about. Thank you, Adriana, for that. Now we can open the floor again for a few minutes more. And I see that we have already 2 hands raised. So we can start with Sadia first, please.
مساء الخير. شكرا جزيلا على هذه المحاضرة.
Thank you very much for this very valuable discussion and the previous ones as well. In fact, Iraq is one of 5 countries that are badly affected by climate change. And in fact, we have problems because of the greenhouse emissions. This is one of the problems in Iraq, especially in the south of Iraq. Sometimes the temperature is 50 to 60 degrees Celsius, sorry. And we have a lot of economic problems, standard of living. We are the source of the human civilization, but we have problems with fisheries and a lot of problems, and they are actually affecting, these problems are affecting the people who are now having to migrate to other places. Now, these areas that are affected by poverty and by climate change has increased by almost 40%. And I can say that also every year we have that a lot of people are suffering of cancer. Almost in every family, people are there's someone who's suffering from these problems because of such causes. There are some local communities that have been affected, especially in the indigenous peoples areas. Also, these are the areas that were the cradle of civilization. These are the places that are mostly suffering because of policies. And in fact, through our presence in HIC, we tell you that we need you to support Iraq. Iraq, 70% of the water is coming from Iran and Turkey. And unfortunately, we have problems, and it's we need to build dams. We need projects, irrigation, cultivation projects, and let me say that I hope that you are going to pressure countries to sign some of these agreements that are going to make an effect, so that those people can give us back our water and our quota of water. And we want them, those who are suffering, we want to stop their suffering, really. Thank you very much. And I believe that he can actually take some good actions in this regard. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sadia, for sharing with us the Iraq situation. Hala, please go ahead.
شكرا هنريكي.
Thank you, Enrique, and thank you, Kelly, Eric, Marie. I believe if we take this conversation to to ask this question. All the produced instructions and policies and even agreements all over the world, are they taking us to a good level, legally speaking, in the field of human rights, or are we just setting frameworks just to say that we did the job? Let's talk about the implementation. Yolande asked about the implementation. We all are asking about implementation, but if we look at the UN report that is talking actually about litigation since 2017, we will find that this has increased by the double or more than a double. So in 2017, we had some cases. Now we have a lot more cases. If we look at the report that is emphasizing this point, it is asking about abolishing laws in some countries and introducing laws in other countries, about the work of companies like Shell that is paying a lot of money in litigation cases in order to make it up for those who were affected. I believe that Eric can help me and answer what are the real ways that we need to use in order not to just work in the field of local to go to litigation, be it at national or international levels. We are now in 2024. We are waiting for the High Court of Justice. The International Court of Justice, I believe there was a decision that was taken in last March, to go to The Hague. But what are the means that can be used by local communities in order to take litigation to the level of climate change cases? How can they do that? Thank you, Eric, and thank you for all those who made interventions. Thank you all. We have benefited from all of you.
Thank you very much, Hala. And we have Derek right now. Derek, do you hear us? No? Maybe he raised his hand by mistake. I don't know. Well, we are running without time, so I would like to invite you to continue this conversation on Google Classroom. And I think that the topics that Eric summarized and the question we did for him about how our coalition can organize our advocacy work on climate justice will be helpful through the whole process of this climate justice colonial space. So Derek, are you able to talk now? He said he needed to be unmuted. Okay, we are trying to help you, but right now, considering the time, I'll give the floor to Diana. I would like to thank a lot our speakers today, David, Marie, Kelly, and Eric. It was a pleasure to have you with us today. And Diana, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Enrique. You've done an amazing job as our moderator. Same to Abir, Hala, and the rest of the team. Thank you also to all our speakers and our participants. I'll just beg 3 minutes of your time just to quickly highlight steps forward, particularly in relation to the next session. Now, the first thing I want to quickly highlight is that we really always want to hear from you, particularly on how we can improve our sessions. Therefore, we put together an evaluation form that asks you to kindly help us improve, enhance, and to make our sessions better. Remember, after our co-learning, our climate justice sessions that are in the next 2 weeks, we have our social production of habitat co-learning sessions in November. So we always look forward to learn. Yolande has put in the chat links to the evaluation forms. You will see there in English, Spanish, French, and Arabic. Please click on them and already start sending your input. Otherwise, we will also send this information on email. Now, next week, we have another exciting session. And this time we'll be looking at identifying the differences and similarities of common struggles and strategies of climate justice. Again, we will of course send an emails and WhatsApp messages with this information, but please register for the session. We will have discussants that include Dr. Emmanuel Osuteye, Abir Butme, who will give us a context of the Palestinian context, and of course Astrid, who will also give us a context of the Latin America side. So we will have quite the discussions, and particularly from this session, we really want to hear from you, because here we are now exchanging struggles, we're exchanging victories, we're trying to see what exactly can we learn from each other, what are the real life stories that are happening in your region that you can bring to this forum so that we are able to share these strategies and to learn together on how to improve our climate justice advocacy strategy. Therefore, on that note, I will ask you again, I'll invite you to the Google Classroom. You have already been sent invites to the classroom, but if you still cannot access it, please check out the chat where Yolande has put the link and a code to access the Google Classroom. And in this space, you will see the three or four questions posted there, inviting you to put your input. So far, most of the content we have been using for this session has been coming from the Google Classroom. So we'd really, really want you to share your thoughts, to share your comments, and most of all, to share your real life experiences. With that, I will stop sharing. And once again, thank you very much. Please be on the lookout for an email from the GS with all this information, for the WhatsApp messages. And as usual, let's take a photo. Let's remember this amazing day that we had together. So I'll just ask you to smile your brightest. Let's see those beautiful smiles. And yes, please feel free to switch on your video, smile. Let's see those amazing smiles. You're looking very lovely. You're looking very good. And it's, of course, amazing to see you. Thank you again, and see you next week, hopefully. Looking forward to seeing you in the same space. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you to our speakers, to our participants for all the input and comments. We really appreciate it. And of course, to our facilitators, thank you so, so much. See you next week, guys. Goodbye.
Gracias también a quienes nos apoyaron en el chat, traduciendo.
I just want to thank all the people that helped us translate the comments in the chat box.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And for interpreters as well. Okay, goodbye.
Hasta luego. Por favor, equipo, no olviden permanecer en la sala.
Please, team, don't forget to stay in the room.
Goodbye to everyone. Just remain the
Hasta
facilitators team and strategic team, please. Detenemos la grabación.
Can we
Everyone,
stop the recording?
stop recording right now.